Anyway, it's good to be with you today. I got to start my day out great. This week, we have our executive farm management class in town. These are a group of farmers from all over the Southeast. About half of them are from North Carolina, but they're also from Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia as well. And they are a great, tremendous group of farmers. Why don't y'all at least stand up? Stand up. I want to recognize them. They came. I don't think they knew they were going to have to listen to me again, so. This is a terrific program that we have at NC State University. I get to work with Michelle Granger and Margaret Huffman on this program, and hope you'll ask us about it afterwards. I do have some good news about the ag economy, and I'll tell you, it was an exciting year last year. I was not here last year. I had to miss. I was actually working in the administration as a senior economist on the Council of Economic Advisors, and I spent a lot of time on trade. A lot of time, by the way, Mike, we don't call it a trade war, they're trade negotiations. So just wanted to set you straight on that. So I spent a lot of time looking at the situation with China. I also got to work on the bilateral agreement with Japan, as well as look at a potential bilateral with Great Britain. I worked a lot on USMCA, and then also looked at some of our negotiations with the European Union, which are always quite interesting. So I'll try to bring a little bit of that insight. I'm going to skip through some slides fairly quickly at the beginning because I want to get to talk about the impact of what our trade with China means. And it's much deeper than just the trade negotiations or trade war. Just want to remind you where our ag income comes from in North Carolina. If you look at North Carolina, about 2/3 of our farm gate income come from the value of poultry and hogs and cattle. And as you see there, broilers are the top, hogs are second, and then turkeys. And we are the second leading producer of broilers in the United States, and the second leading producer of hogs in the United States. So very important parts of our economy that I want you to keep in mind, because we're going to come back to that and talk about it in a little bit. Mike mentioned how our sector has shrunk, and yeah, it's been pretty painful. We went from a high back in 2014, and last year we were about 48% of what we were in 2014. It's been pretty rough. You know, we used to have tobacco to fall back on, and tobacco was rougher than most of the areas in this current farm downturn. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. I want to get this one out of the way because this is the one that everybody wants to talk about, right? Y'all just knew that I had to mention hemp and cannabis. Well, it is important. There's a lot going on. Everybody in the world is excited that this is going to be the next savior of our farm economy. And I have a lot of friends out in Kentucky and do a lot of work with them, and I can tell you, they're pretty pumped about it. And I hate to tell them, my guess is North Carolina is going to wind up, when this all settles, and there's going to be a lot of blood on the floor before it settles out. But North Carolina is probably going to wind up being one of the low-cost production areas for a lot of reasons. You've heard a lot about, the rules, and there's a lot to be done there. There's a lot of controversy about USDA's rules, how that works with the states. I'm not going to get into all that because you hear about that all the time. I'm going to skip right to what business model do you think might emerge as the one that succeeds? Because they're all over the board now. We have processors from doing it in their kitchen to, very sophisticated high-level operations. So what business model does Blake Brown think will dominate here? Now, I could be wrong. I have been a few times. So this is a slide from Euromonitor International. And I think they've got some really, really good insights on it. The first question you have to ask is, what will the final products look like? Because the one thing in this industry so far is that the final products are not well defined. They're all over the board. Some of them are snake oil-like-ish in dimension because they cure everything, but there's a huge amount of potential here, and so as we see final products actually emerge from this and become more well-defined, it will help shape what business model turns out to be the one that succeeds. The second is, notice I say who can comply with FDA regulation. Now, we don't have FDA regulation right now, and I'm not going to say if it happens. I'm going to say when FDA regulation happens. That's going to be a game changer. That's going to be a watershed moment. I don't know how long that's going to take. Is it going to be 3 years, 5 years? I don't know. They move pretty slow at FDA, but it's going to happen, and it will change this whole industry as soon as it does happen. And then I want you to think about who has a good grasp of controlling this product all the way from production at the farm level to the retail level. And if you look there, if you can see those black letters, you see that I have the tobacco industry sphere of influence. And you've got a plethora of products there that go all the way from hemp fiber products on the left-hand side all the way to cannabis as a drug, perhaps prescription drugs coming out of it on the right-hand side, and then a whole spectrum in between of cosmetic-like products, recreational products, health supplements, dietary supplements in between. Products are going to come out along that whole spectrum as this merges. And what's interesting is that the tobacco industry is very well positioned to control this industry in many ways. And we're seeing that in North Carolina already. They know how to produce at the farm level a highly regulated product, right? They do that. They know how to comply with FDA regulation. They know how to process this product. And they also know how to control retail space for a highly regulated product. So the tobacco industry model looks like one right now will be one that may emerge as a dominant model here. We're going to see big pharmaceutical companies very interested in the drug end of this sphere of products that come out. What's going to really be fascinating, and I won't be at all surprised, is if you see some kind of partnership between big pharma companies and big tobacco. That might not happen, but it's clearly possible. So let's just wait and see. All right, here's the grower questions. Flue-cured farmers, it's probably good to be trying to see whether or not this might fit your operation. But be very careful. Be careful who you do business with. Be careful of what you're producing because the specs are very tight. You can lose a lot of money. Yes, there is a lot of money to be made, but the risk is very high now, so just be sure that you take care of that risk. All right, let me say a word about a couple of other products before we get into the trade. I work with peanuts as well. And it's going to sleep. That's not a good thing. There we go. All right. I work with peanuts as well. Peanuts is a good example of how farm policy can shape a commodity. If you went back to prior to 2018 under the 2014 Farm Bill, we saw a huge increase in peanut acreage in the southeast. That had to do a lot with what we call generic acres. And I won't get into that, but those of y'all that are familiar with the Farm Bill understands how that works. In 2018, actually prior to the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill, they passed some legislation that created a seed cotton program, and that did away with those generic acres, generic base that we had seen. And as a result, it took away incentives to produce a lot more peanuts, and we saw peanut acreage come down. And it's both a double-edged sword. I mean, those generic acres had been a nice thing for our peanut farmers in the southeast, but they had also caused price compression between Virginia-type peanuts and runner-type peanuts. And now that that's gone, we're seeing the Virginia price come up a little bit with a greater difference between Virginias as runners. Only got 2 years under us. It's not a very big sample, but it seems to be working in the direction that an economist would suspect. So, all right, fresh produce. Very important in North Carolina and in the southeast. We import most of the fresh produce we eat in the United States. Now, having said that, we export a lot too. We export in the United States about $12 billion. A lot of that was going to China and was very much affected by the trade war. But we also import a lot. It's very important in our state, and we do have one very dominant place in our state in this produce industry globally, and that's our sweet potato industry. We're exporting 20 to 25% of our sweet potatoes. We've gone through some very competitive, some big game-changing times in sweet potatoes in the last few years, but last year we had a good crop with good yields. We had decent prices. While we can easily overstep sweet potatoes and get ahead of the demand is growing very robustly. This is going to continue to be a good market. But if we want to continue to be competitive, we have to think about that. We have to be forceful, as our sweet potato producers have, in pursuing that European market and also pursuing this strong U.S. market for this product, a superfood as many people would rank it. All right, now let's talk a little bit about trade and China. This is what the president said. Mike referred to this. I don't like that. Is it disappearing on y'all too? Uh-oh. There we go. Phase 1 is a big, big number. This is a quote. It is a big percentage of the deal. President Trump told reporters it's pretty much all for farmers. Well, about $80 billion of $200 billion was for farmers, so it was a very big component of it. This is specifically the statement put out by USTR. It says China will purchase and import on average at least $40 billion of U.S. food, agricultural, and seafood products annually for a total of at least $80 billion over the next 2 years. Well, are they going to be able to buy $40 billion? That's a lot. These are exports of raw agricultural products from the United States. If you'll notice back in 2014, we exported $28 billion to China. In 2017, we exported $24 billion. And then in 2018, which was when we really started to see the trade war escalate, we exported only $13 billion. Now look, if I had the numbers on top of these charts, you'd see that our total ag exports actually went up in 2018. And if we had time, we'd talk about trade diversion because it works and it moderates the impacts of even trade wars like this. So can they get to $40 billion? Well, they're going to have to buy a lot more than just raw ag export products. And if you think back to that statement I just read in the previous slide, it says they're going to buy food, agricultural, and seafood. Well, they pretty much cleaned our crock on seafood, so there's probably not going to be much of that. But they're going to have to buy basically value-added products, and they're going to have to buy high-value ag products from us. And that's important, that implication for them to get anywhere close. Now, what about the the coronavirus? I emailed one of folks I met at USTR the other day. He's high-ranking over the ag trade negotiations, and I said, is there anything officially that you can tell me about what the coronavirus what impact it will have on the Phase 1 trade deal? And he didn't really give me a direct answer. I was a little surprised he returned my email because if they don't want to speak about it, a lot of times you just won't hear from them. But he said he's going to refer me to an interview that Larry Kudlow, who is the chair of the National Economic Council, had with Fox News this morning. And his statement was it's probably going to slow it down some. And I think the markets reflect that, especially when we talk about lean hog futures. We see that they went up. They were getting pretty excited about it, but then once the coronavirus, we started talking about it more, the near-term contracts went down some, and I think that reflects that uncertainty. So I don't think it's going to derail it, but yes, it could slow it down some. We could see that happen. Well, what will China buy? Those that are highlighted, or the bold, are the ones that are specifically mentioned in the trade agreement or for Phase 1. Interestingly, soybeans, at least I couldn't find it in there. And I'll tell you why I don't think it was in there. Because soybeans have been our #1 product. They're the ones that we talked about for the most part. But all these others are in there. Corn, it has to do with some corrective action that the Chinese are going to take on some tariff rate quotas they have on corn. And basically, we had filed a complaint against them in the World Trade Organization. They say they're going to fix that. The ones to really look at here are pork and poultry, especially for North Carolina. Very, very significant. The other one is tobacco. Now, when the trade war started in 2018, it devastated our tobacco industry because the China tobacco just said, we're not going to buy any tobacco this year. It left some of our buyers holding large inventories. It cut contracts severely for farmers that were dependent on China. Is that going to come back? Well, I think so. I'm pretty optimistic, and if you want to get the full story on that, just come to the Tobacco Growers meeting tomorrow, and you'll get to hear a presentation that delves into that a little bit more. I'm pretty optimistic that China's going to come back for several reasons in tobacco. Now, will it impact our contracted pounds this year? It's getting pretty late. I hope so, but I'm not sure. The only problem we have is we have so many other factors that are causing use of U.S. tobacco to decline, including exports to other traditional customers. China is needed just to offset some of those declines. So will it be a big increase even if they jumped right back in this year? Probably not, because of all those other factors that we're seeing. Let me talk a little bit about cotton. Cotton is a good example of trade diversion in this whole thing. China put tariffs on cotton. We export most of our cotton. China is a big customer. But what we saw, and if you look at China and Hong Kong's imports of raw cotton, look at what I've circled there. Look at Brazil. And the blue bar is 2018, the orange bar is 2019, and then look over at the circle around the United States. If you look at 2018, you'll see that imports, we exported quite a bit more cotton to China than Brazil did. Well, then what happened in the next year, 2019? Well, it just flipped back. With the tariffs in place, you know, they imported more Brazilian cotton and we imported less, and they imported less of our U.S. cotton. But if you looked at our overall cotton exports, they didn't change that much. It was just a flipping around of that. All right, poultry and hogs. I'm going to tell you that this is something I started watching over a year ago because I happened to be in the company of a vet who knew a lot about swine whenever African swine fever was first mentioned. It wasn't in the news. I started watching this. This has probably been maybe the biggest disruption in agriculture that I've seen in my 30-year tenure. Huge disruption. And frankly, I think it was a big factor in the Chinese coming to the table to settle phase one because they need meat. They lost, by USDA estimates, 40% of their swine herd, and they raise 50% of the world's swine, and they eat 50% of the world's swine. So when you think about losing 20% of the global supply of swine in 1 year, that's a huge disruptor. That's why you don't see soybeans mentioned in the phase one trade agreement. They don't need more soybeans. They need less feedstuffs. That's the reason we see soybeans ticking along and even diving down under every once in a while, you know, below $9, because the global demand is down because of African swine fever. That's what it is, and that's very, very significant. It's also spreading throughout Asia. If you look at 2017 China pork consumption, 56 million metric tons. That's half the world's pork consumption. The forecast by USDA is that in 2020, China will produce 36 million metric tons. That's a 20 million metric ton drop. Just to put that in perspective, the U.S. produced 13 million metric tons is predicted to produce 13 million metric tons in 2020. So they have lost more in production than we actually produce in 1 year. That's how big it is. If you look at what China did with imports of soybeans globally, their imports of imports globally of soybeans dropped by over 16 million metric tons. So most of that came out of Arrowhead because of the trade war. But they didn't go to Brazil and buy more soybeans. Brazil's exports to China were not up, and this is why, because they just didn't need them. Okay, well, how much would pork and poultry production globally have to increase to take care of this deficit in China? They would have to increase at least 11 or 12% in order to take care of that. And that's just not going to happen in 1 year. We're constrained in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of just the biological cycle for animals to be able to do that. Well, but in North Carolina, we're probably well positioned, and this is the good news, Commissioner. We are well positioned to take advantage of this huge export opportunity. If you look at our broiler capacity in North Carolina, if you've driven around, you know that we've expanded tremendously in the last 5 years. We've got companies like House of Rayford that still have not got up to full capacity in new facilities they've got. Mount Air is probably not up to full capacity yet. So we've got a lot of capacity coming online now, and the Chinese, I think, even though they like pork better than poultry, I think they're going to have to eat a lot of chicken as well as pork in order to get through this crisis. So, how much could we really increase in 1 year? Because we're limited by the biological cycle of animals, and we're also limited by the housing that we have to raise these animals. Well, I've talked to several folks in the poultry industry, and if you look at that, one of the things they can do is increase the utilization of their hatching eggs. They have a margin of error there. They can increase the utilization of that. They can increase the birds per house a little bit, not much, but it makes a big difference when you add it all up. They can increase the turn rates. In other words, they can hold growers out for less time and ask them to clean their houses out quicker and increase some that way. And they can also, if there are houses that are older that they were planning to take out of production, they can probably keep those for a couple more years. So I think we're well positioned. I think I'm pretty conservative when I look at this and say that our poultry production in North Carolina could easily increase over 10% in 2020. I think that's a fairly conservative measure. It's very important. So if we did that, that would put revenues from North Carolina poultry to increase between $300 and $500 million this year, and that would be a big help. Now in hogs, we're a little bit more constrained. We probably can't increase as much, but there's probably some tweaks that can be done there to increase it a little bit as well. So what are the takeaways? Well, going back to our first slides, hemp, cannabis is an emerging market. There's lots of risk and there's lots of reward where there's lots of risk. You just got to be really careful. So be careful who you work with and gauge carefully how much risk you take. Continued growth in the markets for U.S. sweet potatoes, but we can easily exceed supply, so we have to keep on track with that. This is still a superfood. It's one of our great commodities that we have going forward. But then looking at the China thing, the African swine fever is such an important factor in this, and particularly how the Chinese proceed in the ag part of the deal. They're going to have to buy a whole lot of product if they get to $40 billion. I think they're going to buy as much poultry, they're going to buy as much pork, and they're going to buy some beef too, as they possibly can in order to do that because they need the meat. Hopefully they're going to come over here and buy a lot of tobacco this year too, and that's going to help. All that will help them move towards that $40 billion. If you look at that, it is a huge, huge export opportunity for our pork and poultry industry. As I said, I think it's going to increase us conservatively in the neighborhood of $300 to $500 million in 2020. Now, China doesn't need as many soybeans, but I think the basis for North Carolina corn will strengthen. And I forgot to mention that when I was going through there. I was down in the Blacklands speaking to the Blacklands Farm Managers Association a couple of weeks ago, and they said the basis on corn in the Blacklands had jumped to 95 cents. Now, I don't think you're going to see a huge increases in the price of corn, and definitely not soybeans. But when you look at basis in our state, because of the increased demand for poultry and pork, we're going to see that basis get just about as strong as it possibly can. It will not surprise me if we see that basis hit $1 and maybe exceed $1 this year. And that's because of the strong local demand that we have for these products. Corn is interesting. I'll finish with this because I forgot to say it earlier. Corn demand in China is actually going up. Feedstuff demand for corn is going down. They don't need as much for feed, but they use a huge amount for industrial use. So I'll end that. I think that's sort of a positive note, Commissioner. So look out for that. If you're in the poultry business, I hope you have more flocks than you've ever had in your house this coming year, and that will hopefully put a little bit more money in your pocket. Thank you very much.